Hello, I'm John the Counter-Apologist, and I've got another live response video for you today, going after my favorite Christian apologist, William Lane Craig, and talking about his self-referentially incoherent meta-ethic, which really kind of undermines his moral argument. If you're familiar with my Countering the Moral Argument series, you're going to know about this already, but rather than have you go watch that, I put together a special video to highlight Craig, in his own words, contradicting himself. Here we go.
God's own holy and loving nature supplies the absolute standard against which all actions are measured. He is by nature loving, generous, just, faithful, kind, and so forth. And thus, if God exists, objective moral values exist.
He also goes on to say that apologists could be interpreted as saying that objective moral values means that they must be object-like. Well, that's completely wrong. What one means by objective here is mind-independent. Therefore, it follows logically that the transcendent cause of the universe is an unembodied mind. And thus we're brought not merely to an uncaused cause of the universe, but to its personal creator.
All right. So, just a quick coverage of this. He tells us that, steelmanning his view even, is he tells us that God's nature is the ontological foundation of the good, the objective moral values that constitute the good. But then he tells us that objective is not to be thought of as object-like, but it is to be thought of as mind independence. But then, in another context, he talks about his God being a disembodied mind. How is the nature of a mind independent? I don't get it. So this is a really fun objection. I mean, it doesn't really get much better than this. And so I like to use it fairly often whenever a Christian apologist brings up the moral argument, which, as you can imagine, is fairly frequent. While on the Real Atheology Facebook page, which I highly recommend you go like their page on Facebook if you use it, like and subscribe to their channel. Awesome bunch of guys. I used to be a host on their podcast, left amicably for other reasons, but I strongly recommend taking a look at their content. They're absolutely a bunch of brilliant atheist philosophers of religion and some agnostics as well. Anyway, while on their page, I had a gentleman, a theist, respond to me like, hey, look, this isn't really a contradiction. Craig addressed this because the guy I was talking to asked him about it. He recognized the problem, asked Craig about it at a conference in 2012, which is recorded and on YouTube. So I have the video, and I want to review it, look at Craig's response, see if it's actually worthwhile. Maybe I'm wrong, right? Could be wrong here. So let's take a look at what Craig says and whether or not this works.
Earlier, when you were talking about the moral argument, you mentioned the definition of objective, and included in that you said that objective is mind independent. And then we as Christians, believing that God is an unembodied mind, then believe that all objective truth and objectivity is grounded in at least one unembodied mind. So do we need to make a distinction there between minds?
This gets to be a really tricky point. I think we all have an intuitive grasp of the difference between things that are mind-dependent and things that are objective and actually exist without our minds. For example, a rainbow doesn't really exist out there. It's a visual perception that one has because of the way the water molecules reflect the light. A rainbow is not a mind-independent object.
Okay, quick pause and interlude here. In my original video and Craig's response to that, I said, hey, sometimes you might interpret an apologist to mean that moral values must be object-like. Maybe you could be, because depending on the apologist and how they present it, it kind of sounds that way. And I want to point out, when Craig's trying to clarify the concept of what objectivity versus mind independence means, he kind of sounds exactly like that. So just a point of why we might think this is sort of what they're hinting at, because they kind of do talk like it a little bit, especially when clarifying. But we're just going to keep going here.
It's a mind-dependent object. Similarly, a mirage of water, when you see the water shimmering on the highway in the hot summer, That mirage is not an independently existing reality. It's mind dependent, right? It's very different than an actual body of water that you could go jump in and swim. So I think we all have this kind of intuitive grasp of the difference between something that's just subjective, it's just in your mind, and something that's objective, that's independent of your mind. Now, the tricky part is that given theism, nothing is mind independent in another sense, in the sense that God is a mind and nothing exists independent of God because God creates everything. But I mean, in that sense, galaxies and planets are not mind independent entities. Nothing would be mind independent in that sense. So,
All right. If I wanted to poke a little bit of fun and maybe be a little uncharitable, like sometimes Craig can be in some of his debates based on statements that his opponent might have made in published work, you could say this is a great argument for atheism. Premise one, if God exists, nothing exists in a mind-independent way, including galaxies and planets. Premise two, galaxies and planets exist in a mind-independent way. Conclusion, therefore, God doesn't exist. Bit tongue-in-cheek, but a fun quote to point to, I think, for Craig. Let's keep going. I'm just going to let it go until the end. Promise I'll be good from here on.
in that sense, the whole distinction would just collapse. And so it's obviously not that sense in which one is talking about mind dependence when one says that on naturalism, moral values are just subjective. We mean more in the sense of illusions or mirages or something like that, not causally sustained by God, who is an ultimate mind. So I think it's very clear the sense in which one is using the word mind dependent as opposed to being causally dependent upon God, even though it isn't just a subjective reality.
All right, so let's talk about Craig's response here and why I think it doesn't work. I think he's got a misrepresentation of the objection, right? So on Craig's own view of moral values are not causally dependent upon God, who is an ultimate disembodied mind, right? So think about his example there. He talks about how, well, nothing's mind independent because God, who is a mind, created them. So galaxies and planets, whatever, don't exist mind independently because God created and sustains them. Well, that's not what the objection is talking about here, right? Let's steelman his own view, right? His view is that God's nature is the ontological equivalent or foundation of the good, okay? So God, on his view, right, God's nature is necessary because God is a necessary being. So if God is loving, then God is necessarily loving for whatever reason, that's its own problem, but that's his view. And you're going to say, well, loving is good because it's in God's nature. Well, God didn't get to pick his nature, right? Because it's a necessary fact. God did not create his nature, right? The way he created planets and everything else. So God's nature is the nature of a mind, and that means the nature of a mind cannot be mind independent, right? In the same way that, well, God created a planet and the planet exists mind independently even though God created it. There's a big difference between the two senses in which we're talking about mind independence. Now, let's go, and so that's why I think this as a response simply doesn't work, and it's still a self-defeating meta-ethic. It's still self-referentially incoherent. But let's try and put the best possible spin on this, right? So let's say he means, humans and human nature would be an analog. Humans have minds, right? And we would say that something like human nature exists, right? And human nature can be the ontological ground of something, perhaps. At least if God's nature can be ontological grounding for something, then at least theoretically other natures could ontologically ground something else. And we're going to say that these natures exist in a mind-independent way. And for humans, I think that maybe does make a bit of sense, because we're not just minds. We're embodied creatures with all sorts of things about our nature and our evolutionary history or whatever. But God as a mind, the disembodied mind, and having his nature somehow be said to be mind-independently existing, I don't know if that really makes any sense. I don't think it does. But we're going to go with it. Now, this view that natures exist kind of presents another problem for Craig and his case against atheistic ethical views. So we're going to go and play one more clip of Craig talking about what he thinks morality would be like on atheism.
On a naturalistic view, moral values are just the byproduct of biological evolution and social conditioning. Just as a troop of baboons exhibit cooperative and even altruistic behavior because natural selection has determined it to be advantageous in the struggle for survival, so their primate cousins, Homo sapiens, have similarly evolved behavior for the same reason. As a result of sociobiological pressures, there has evolved among Homo sapiens a sort of herd morality which functions well in the perpetuation of our species. But on an atheistic view, there doesn't seem to be anything that makes this morality objectively true. The philosopher of science Michael Ruse reports, the position of the modern evolutionist is that humans have an awareness of morality because such an awareness is of biological worth. Morality is a biological adaptation, no less than our hands and feet and teeth. Considered as a rationally justifiable set of claims about an objective something, ethics is illusory. I appreciate that when somebody says, "Love thy neighbor as thyself," they think they are referring above and beyond themselves. Nevertheless, such reference is truly without foundation. Morality is just an aid to survival and reproduction, and any deeper meaning is illusory. End quote.
All right, so let's talk about this. Craig and other apologists absolutely love that money quote from Michael Ruse's book on ethics, Evolutionary Ethics, which I actually am a bit partial to. And so they really make Ruse's view in evolutionary ethics look like it is completely subjectivist. That's not quite true. Ruse's view is relativistic, but by species, not individual, right? So on this view, and as Craig even says, we have evolved a herd morality, but there's nothing on atheism that makes it objectively true. But the herd morality is based on human nature. And so there are objective facts about human nature that have made us evolve this herd morality. And that is objectively a fact if you say that natures exist objectively, even if they're natures of beings with minds, and that objective means mind independent and this nature can exist in this way, well then you've got, by his own definition and his own description of a herd morality, an objective moral system on atheism. Right? So once you push on his definition of objectivity and you kind of get him to clarify it, you start to see that the same way he grounds his objective moral system, we kind of can do exactly the same thing on even the least charitable sort of view of what morality could be on atheism. And I don't think that so like there's the thing, so there's a conflict here, what I'm talking about, and Michael Ruse's quote where he's like, pointing to something objective is illusory, right? Well, Ruse, in that sense, I think is talking about objective morality in a true mind-independent sense against something like moral Platonism, right? Which I think, if we're going to be strong about this objective as mind-independence thing, is probably one of the only truly objective in a mind-independent way senses of moral values existing would be moral Platonism. Anything else, I think values have to do with minds necessarily. You have to have a mind to value anything. So I think talking about ethics in this objective sense is a bit of a problem. Now, you might say, well, this is species relative, And so that's sort of a problem, but I don't think so. So in other contexts, Craig's will talk about how a shark, and great white sharks specifically, forcibly copulate. And it's true. Male great white sharks will attack the female and forcibly copulate to impregnate the female shark. If you want an example of teleological evil and why there is no God, that's a pretty good example. Now, conversely, in humans, according to our nature, rape is wrong. It is bad. It does not contribute to the overall survival of our species. It breaks down our social coherence in terms of forming a society to let us tackle problems as a social group rather than individuals. And it doesn't help in good numbers produce offspring of the sort that's consistent with our nature that lets us flourish, right? So we have and we also have the ability to reflect on our actions and all sorts of other cognitive developments that make us moral agents. So I don't think it's really a problem to say that, well, on atheism you have this species relativistic moral value system. Well, of course, that just makes sense that it would be this way. Like, I don't hold my cat morally accountable for vomiting on the floor, whereas I would if for eating too much, whereas if I had my kid or something had done so. It doesn't apply. And so what I want to close out here on is, I think, like I mentioned, I think this type of objectivity is problematic, thinking of it in this way. And let's clarify the intuition, because when Craig goes at the moral argument, he talks about premise 2, where we know objective moral values and duties exist. And I'm really questioning whether objective means mind independence, whether our intuition captures that. And I think this is very important, because another response that Craig hasn't used here, that other apologists will give me when I bring this up, is they say mind independence means independent of finite minds, which is just an ad hoc modification of the definition of objective that is not standard, and I really don't think is captured by intuition. It kind of defines morality in objectivity, at least in terms of God, so it's very self-serving and ad hoc. But either way, whether mind independent or independent of finite minds, I think that's not the intuition we have. The intuition we have is that morality or moral rules, like it's wrong to torture infants for fun, right, is objective in the sense, not that it's a mind independent thing, but that it's not like a subjective topic. Whereas I could say, I like chocolate and my daughter likes vanilla. That's a subjective thing. Nobody can just choose to say, well, I like torturing babies for fun, and that's sort of okay. No, the principle of morality applies equally to all moral agents, and the only moral agents we are aware of right now are us humans, right? And if maybe we found some other being that was a moral agent like us in enough relevant ways, right? Then we would apply that moral system to us, so much as it kind of would overlap with our own nature, right? We would think they'd be at least somewhat like us. And so I think that kind of objectivity is really what the intuition gets at. And ironically, on Michael Roos's, what he presents as the most reductionistic kind of evolutionary ethics that he thinks would hold if atheism was true, meets that. Right? And I don't want to just say, hey, if you're an atheist, you have to hold to evolutionary ethics. You don't. There are a wide variety of atheist-compatible meta-ethical theories. So it's not just evolutionary ethics versus modified divine command theory for theism. You have a whole bunch of options. But hopefully this video has shown why I think Craig's own meta-ethical theory is self-referentially incoherent, and why, even on the worst case for atheism, we still get an objective moral value system, either by Craig's own definition of objectivity or by a better capture of what we mean by objective moral values and duties exist. Thanks for watching.